Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to discuss Jean Michel Rabate's essay Alphybettyformed Verbage, the shape of sounds and letters in Finnegans Wake. This can be found in Volume 2, Issue 3 of Word and Image, published in 1986, and is a real touchstone for understanding the accretive play, or the central drift of Joyce's semantics, as it's called by Rabaté. Using post-structuralist theory, this is going to be really great for helping us understand how Joyce deconstructs the idea of textuality through letters and their associations with sounds, which is characteristically problematized in the siglum of Finnegans Wake. We first and exclusively see these in a collected list on page 299 in a footnote in Finnegans Wake, called the Doodles family. But we don't see them all together other than that, although we do see them variously inflected throughout Finnegans Wake, sprinkled in ways that really challenge the idea of what is character and what is the function of a letter. Because both of these have dual meanings, right? A character can be a individual A, B, C, right? Those are alphabetic characters. Or you can have the idea of a person, right? Of a character who has a character arc and whatnot. And then a letter, too, can be an individual letter, A, B, or C, or it can be a letter sent through the mailbox, right? So all of these multiple associations are experimented with in Finnegans Wake for Rabaté, and he's going to be analyzing the way that this plays out. Speaking of, in addition to Finnegans Wake, Ezra Pound's cantos and Arno Schmidt's Zettelstrom, he says that when experimenting with languages, these texts create a language of their own. They displace all conventional norms of creation as well as of reception, and become idiolects, properly speaking, which cannot easily be reduced to a set of codes underlying them. Hence, the entire semiological situation must be taken into account to interpret these texts, for which a simple grammar of meaning is inadequate, since it should also describe the games the text plays with meaning, against meaning, or even without any discernible meaning at all. And this is one of the real deconstructive points of Finnegans Wake, that we can talk about textuality and about the games that the text plays with the reader, those hermeneutic back and forths that happen between the written stuff of the text and the thinking mind of the interpreter, without presupposing that signification entails a pre-existent, signified, or referent. Derrida famously talks about this in a number of his essays, where he says that, for example, let's say I'm talking about some book. Well, there need not necessarily be a objective, pre-existing, wholly impartial idea of bookness as such, right? Some essence that pre-exists as a signified, as a concept, nor need there be a referent in the world before I talk about it, right? So language has this fundamental play, this fundamental erring quality that allows for loops of the text, as Rabaté calls it, as it turns over self-reflexively on itself, allowing for the central drift of Joyce's semantics. As such, Rabaté says that Joyce's text is a model of mimetic form, a paradigm of formal enacting of meaning before any meaning can be abstracted by itself. And Rabaté spends a significant amount of time tracing the similarities and differences between Mallarmé and Joyce, showing how both of them are trying to talk of the material basis of the imitative principle, right? The presupposition that language is imitating some objective world which pre-exists, that the concepts are already there and need to be resurrected. Both of these writers are critical of this and want to show the negativity inherent in mimetic language, right? The idea that, as Derrida and Saussure and others have stated, that language doesn't work based off of some idea of presencing, of some originary presence, which is then modified, but rather it works through negation, by saying what something is not, and thereby operating on the basis of another sign in a large structural network. As such, Joyce wants to yield place to the words, mobilized by the shock of their inequality. And that there is a quote from Mallarmé. And the essence of this linguistic revolution really reminds me of one of Joyce's letters that Peter Skrabaniec often quotes. When talking to a Polish writer, Jan Parandowski, Joyce complained that the few fragments which I have published have been enough to convince many critics that I have finally lost my mind, which, by the way, they have been predicting faithfully for many years. And perhaps it is madness to grind up words in order to extract their substance, to create crossbreeds and unknown variants, to open up unsuspected possibilities for those words, to marry sounds which were not usually joined before, although they were meant for one another, to allow water to speak like water, birds to chirp in the words of birds, to liberate all sounds from their servile, contemptible role, and to attach them to the feelers of expressions which grope for definitions of the undefined. With this hash of sounds, I am building the great myth of everyday life. And this is interesting because it shows the sway of Joyce's writing, that it is at one end talking about something universal, something omnipresent, which we need to yield place to. On the other hand, it is talking about the particularities of its instantiation in everyday life. As such, I see a flirtation with a concept that really only Baudrillard manages to sort of formally assert, which is the seduction of the object. Baudrillard states in Fatal Strategies that we are so convinced in the Western tradition that subjectivity rules all that we tend to use this as a strategy to subvert the power of the objects which go beyond our rational grasp. That subjectivity is a way that we can make sense of the world because it reduces them to our subjective experience. And we can often, pretend that we can bracket the world of the objects and just talk about subjectivity, which, a radical phenomenologist like Husserl is going to do. But Joyce is very critical of this, and he wants to try to yield place to the object and to its seductive capacities. And Joyce wants to do this, making objects speak in their own language. As such, Rabaté says that the whole volume of the text functions as a space of some kind, which creates a foil for the smallest possible unit, the letter. Between these two dimensions, the text opens an iconic space of writing, a space which entails a redefinition of reading and writing. And this idea of iconicity is something that Rabaté wants to build up. This idea of signification accreting into idols, which is sort of equivalent to Deleuze and Guattari's idea of territorialization, of signifiers collecting together to form local networks that allow for sense to arise. And Joyce's book is really putting this on the page. We're seeing all these interconnected networks, not stitched apart, but rather packed closer and closer together so that we get more and more in view in a tighter and tighter space. He wants to connect this to Mallarmé's idea that, as he says, poetic language remunerates these faulty languages by providing the surplus money, the extra salary, the component or supplement which metamorphoses all these failings into durable beauty. That Joyce, too, deplores the radical absence of a universal language and sticks to the notion of a book which remains expansion totale de la lettre, right? The total expansion of the letter. We're expanding our gaze so wide to a properly structural level in which we see every structure as properly post-structural, which is to say not final, that it is contingent like everything else and is part of a fulminating, developing process. And we see this in the development of the siglum in Joyce's notebooks and in the various typed scripts and drafts of the text, right? We see that, as Rabaté says, the typography of the text enacts out its own meaning, and the bits of broken English mingle with broken China in a humorous ideogram of our post-Gutenberg galaxy. Joyce stresses the literality of his text, but also affords glimpses of the continually more or less inter-misunderstanding minds of the anti-collaborators. The sigla are both characters of the text and parts of the book. And this idea of the text versus the book is very interesting, because Derrida talks about this, for example, right? That a book is just claiming to tell you facts about the characters, right? About the sort of object-like elements within it, whereas a text is properly self-reflexive and denies a sort of objectivity to textuality, instead yielding to the play of signifiers that fulminate and expand throughout a structure. And Joyce's dialectics is sort of right in between this idea of textuality and bookness, right? In a way, it is a book insofar as it has been written in a published form, and as it is disseminated and sold, it will remain in that published form so long as it continues to be printed. But on the other hand, it is very concerned with this idea of an evasive, accretive textuality, which goes beyond a single interpretation or a single ruling logic. As such, the special effort, Rabaté says, required by Finnegans Wake in order to enact the Mallarméan notion of an expansion totale de la lettre prohibits a neat distinction between levels of sense and levels of pictographic play. Like Iser, Joyce is very concerned with this idea of the pictographic space, of the spatiality of a text, which opens up its own kind of unique hermeneutical register. Apart from, yet connected to the materiality of the text, is a hermeneutic register which develops through an interplay that can't be reduced to a pre-existing sense or a wholly invented after-the-fact sense, right? So this expansion is taking place in the present tense, and really all of Finnegans Wake is taking place in the present tense, because it itself is constantly presencing. It is enacting signifiers in a way to bring forth a present which has not yet fully existed and will, in some future, not exist quite the same way. It will return, of course, because it is going to iterate itself over and over, but it will always return as difference. As such, Rabaté says that the problematics of iconicity cannot be separated from the struggle for power between the sons, united as Sean Shem, and HCE in his full symbolic function. When Earwicker is identified with the Russian general shot by Buckley, he is called Old Daldy Icon, and the rest of the television play connects Buckley with the iconoclasts and also with Bishop Berkeley, a philosopher who destroys our eidolons. What thus relates the different signs is not a natural or conventional link, but a symbolic function which is borne by the general power of language. And this power is in part one of fabulation, as Deleuze puts it. It is a fictive power that can separate itself from the contingencies of the material without wholly separating itself from that tradition. It can create a unique space that can self-reflexively comment on itself, on its own limitations, in a sort of conscious way. But it does this not in a purely naturalistic way, or a purely conventional way, but one that sort of tries to merge the difference between the two and track their similarities and differences. The way that language allows for it itself to comment on its own limitations. Rabaté comments on a comment that Joyce leaves in a letter for one of his own passages where he says, "These are the words the reader will see, but not those he will hear." This is interesting for two reasons. One, it seems to highlight again the evasive nature of Finnegans Wake, that it is something that we're trying to comprehend but always seem to be behind. We're always trying to catch up to it. But also it seems to privilege hearing over sight. That seeing is something surface level, but that hearing acquires a depth, and it itself spatializes, right? It creates its own sense of space, kind of like when Heidegger talks about the existential concept of space. He says in Sein und Zeit, in Being and Time, that there are two different kinds of spaces, and we usually only think of one of them. When we talk about space, we tend to think of it purely factically, right? This idea of space as measured in meters or feet or yards. But there is also an existential space, which has to do with our comportment as Dasein towards the spaces, the worlds in which we live, and the way that they act upon us. Such that Heidegger says, for example, a short path can feel especially arduous at times, or a long one extremely mellow. And we can't really separate these from each other. We don't operate in the purely factical world, nor do we operate purely in the existential one. We act at the interstices between these two. Rabaté says in concluding, this shows that the concept of disjunction between the visual series and the musical series is basic in the Wake's iconicity. The mimetic language only imitates itself, comments upon itself, refers back to itself because it is never identical to itself, right? Hence the return of difference, which is a Deleuzian concept. The sigla, for instance, are not identities, but pigeonholes for functions which can be occupied by a vast variety of real or imaginary persons. The letters and curious symbols which crop up here and there do not imply a secret language, invented by a secretive and devious mind, but they oblige the readers to ponder on the reality of language, on its dual aspect and the infinite process of interpretation, of rereading this entails. The reader is asked to add his own signature to the doodles which are scattered in the language. He must become willy-nilly one of the anti-collaborators of the letter of Finnegans Wake itself. The iconicity of the text cannot therefore be reduced to a mimetic principle. It has to take into account the various emblematic, archetypal, stereotypical, and graphological devices through which sound sense and sense sound are made kin again. That being said, that's it for this lecture. I hope that this has helped incite and excite some ideas regarding Finnegans Wake and the relationship between sound and orthography and letters and signification. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it helps me purchase the books necessary to bring y'all content. But no worries, care about yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.